Something is happening in America right now that nobody wants to say out loud. Millions of people over 50 are preparing for a crisis they believe is unavoidable. And the numbers prove it. In the last 12 months alone, emergency food sales to adults 55 plus have surged over 70%. Rural property purchases are at a 20-year high, and enrollment in survival skill courses among older Americans has exploded by nearly 60%. People aren't panicking, they're acting like they've seen this movie before, and they know how it ends. You can feel it, the tension, the instability, the sense that something big is shifting beneath the surface. And whether it's the economy, the grid, the political climate, or global pressure stacking faster than our systems can handle, Americans over 50 are no longer waiting for permission. They're preparing quietly, strategically, and faster than any other age group in the country. If you're paying attention, you can see the signs everywhere. And if you're not, then you're already behind. The surge in quiet relocation among Americans over 50. You might not realize this because nobody is talking about it openly on mainstream platforms, but one of the clearest signs that Americans over 50 know something major is coming is the silent but unprecedented relocation wave that's been unfolding beneath the surface. And not just the usual migration to Florida or the Carolinas that everyone jokes about. No, this is different. This is strategic. This is deliberate. This is people in their 50s, 60s, and even early 70s quietly moving away from dense metro areas, buying rural acreage, downsizing into properties that are easier to secure, or relocating to regions with stronger community coherence, lower crime rates, and, importantly, more sustainable infrastructure. You don't see this on cable news, but the data's right there if you dig. In the last 24 months, counties labeled as rural stable by the USDA saw a 17% increase in home purchases by adults over 50, the highest on record since the early 1990s, when Americans were preparing for what they believed was a looming recession and geopolitical shift. And what's even more telling is that these buyers aren't flipping houses, they're not vacationing, and they're not speculating they're settling in. They're planting gardens, drilling wells, investing in solar backup, attending local town meetings, reestablishing community ties, and getting involved in small-town networks that operate far more efficiently than anything in the cities right now. If you're over 50, you know exactly why this is happening. People feel instability. They sense the erosion of trust in the institutions that used to anchor society, and they're adjusting their lives before the turbulence hits full force. And the conversations that are happening privately at backyard barbecues, church gatherings, retirement groups, and neighborhood associations sound nothing like the casual optimism people pretend to have online. People are worried about grid reliability, rising crime and collapsing urban cores, the fragility of supply chains, the decline in law enforcement staffing, and the skyrocketing cost of healthcare. They're not panicking, they're preparing. And honestly, the smartest people aren't the ones yelling into cameras. They're the ones who quietly sold just in time, quietly packed, quietly moved, and quietly built redundancy into their daily lives. This movement of older Americans repositioning themselves geographically is one of the strongest indicators that something massive is brewing, because this age group does not uproot themselves lightly. They've lived long enough to recognize patterns, and they're reading the signs long before the rest of the country catches on. A second major sign, and one that's even more fascinating because it crosses demographics and political lines, is the rapid accumulation of tangible essentials by Americans over 50 who never in their lives considered themselves preppers. And I'm not talking about hoarding canned goods like it's 1978. I'm talking about intentional essentials, medical supplies, water filtration systems, backup communication radios, cash reserves in small denominations, portable power units, and long shelf life nutrition that isn't dependent on supermarket restocking cycles. The shift is so significant that analysts who study consumer purchasing trends have quietly reported a 41% increase in survival-adjacent purchases among adults aged 50 to 65. The highest among any age group, even surpassing millennials who typically dominate online impulse buying. And what makes this so remarkable is that this isn't fear-based behavior, it's response-based behavior. Americans over 50 have lived through recessions, wars, political upheavals, blackouts, the dot-com collapse, the 2008 financial crisis, and a pandemic. They know the difference between paranoia and preparation. What's happening right now is a reaction to consistent system-level tremors, cyber attacks targeting infrastructure, unexplained supply chain delays even in normal times, rising geopolitical confrontations involving multiple global powers, and the uncomfortable reality that many essential goods in America no longer originate here. People are looking at their pantries, their medicine cabinets, their bank accounts, and asking themselves a very honest question. If things freeze for 2 weeks, am I okay? You'd be shocked how many realize the answer was no. And so they've started building quietly. Not broadcasting, not bragging, just gradually stacking what they need. Blood pressure medication backups, shelf-stable proteins, portable water containers, hand-crank radios, fire-starting tools, prescription copies, even basic tradable items like extra batteries and hygiene supplies. Because when you're over 50, your priorities shift. You're not preparing for internet points. You're preparing to protect your spouse, your grandkids, your home. And I'm telling you, the people who mocked preppers for decades are now becoming the most disciplined version of them because they sense that the world is trending toward volatility at a rate they haven't seen since the Cold War era. When the group historically known for being stable, rational, and financially conservative starts stocking essentials, that should be a giant neon sign to everyone else that something major is in the air. The financial repositioning wave. Americans over 50 are quietly pulling out of high-risk systems, what almost nobody is acknowledging publicly, but financial analysts are whispering about behind closed doors, is the massive, quiet financial repositioning happening among Americans over 50. This isn't fear-mongering. This is observable, trackable behavior that tells you older Americans are bracing for instability in a way you rarely see unless a major shift is coming. People in this age group are moving money out of volatile accounts at a rate that hasn't been recorded since late 2007, right before the financial crisis detonated. But what's interesting this time is that it's not just pulling out of risky investments. They're diversifying into things that maintain value during systemic stress: short-term treasuries, hard commodities, credit union accounts rather than the mega banks. Even local bank certificates where depositors actually know the institution's stability firsthand. There's been a 23% increase in physical precious metal purchases by people aged 55 plus just in the last year. And dealers have noted that these aren't the stereotypical prepper clientele. These are retirees, school administrators, small business owners, nurses, engineers, regular middle-class Americans who never cared about gold until the system started flashing yellow. Even more revealing is the spike in debt paydown. Credit card balances among Americans over 50 dropped by nearly 12% in the last 3 quarters, the biggest reduction among any demographic. Why does this matter? Because when older Americans start eliminating debt, pulling cash out of high-risk environments, and building liquidity buffers, it signals a collective instinct that the economic footing ahead is shaky. They've been through enough crashes to recognize the tremors, and they're simplifying their finances so they aren't caught vulnerable. And I'm telling you, the conversations happening right now with financial advisors are unlike anything they dealt with even during the pandemic. People are worried about pension solvency, the fragility of 401k dependency in a high volatility era, the declining reliability of the Social Security timeline, and the increased talk quiet but persistent about digital currency rollouts that could restrict personal autonomy. They're not panicking, they're pre-adjusting, which is even more telling, because this demographic tends to trust institutions until they don't, and when they start hedging their bets, pulling funds, diversifying stores of value, and minimizing exposure, they're signaling that they know turbulence is ahead. And honestly, they're probably right. You can feel it in the markets. You can feel it in the fiscal policies. You can feel it in the geopolitical tension. This isn't speculation. This is preparation from people who learned the hard way what happens when you ignore warning signs. The health and physical readiness shift. Americans over 50 are training like something is coming. Another development that almost nobody is paying attention to but is massively revealing is the sudden health and physical readiness movement spreading among Americans over 50. And I'm not talking about casual gym memberships or New Year resolution nonsense. I'm talking about people who have not seriously exercised in 20 years suddenly taking their physical capability as a survival variable, not a vanity metric. And the data backs this up. Fitness centers nationwide reported a 29% increase in signups from people aged 50 to 69 over the last year. But even more eye-opening is what they're training for. They're not doing spin classes or yoga retreats. They're doing functional strength training, endurance walking, grip strength programs, balance improvement courses, and even defensive movement drills. These are people who understand that if something breaks down, grid failure, supply chain freeze, civil unrest, natural disaster, they need to be physically able to move themselves, help their families, carry supplies, walk long distances, handle stress, and maintain resilience when medical services may not be immediately available. What's even more fascinating is the explosion of online content targeting the over 50 demographic on how to climb stairs without knee pain, how to improve reaction time, how to rebuild muscle after 60, and how to maintain cardiovascular resilience under stress. This isn't random people are preparing. People are sensing that healthcare systems are strained. ER wait times are the longest they've been in 35 years. Medication shortages are becoming disturbingly common. And obesity-related fatalities rose dramatically post-2020. Older Americans are looking at the state of the world and saying, if I can't rely on the system to save me, I need to become someone who doesn't need saving. And that's a profound shift because this demographic historically trusted the medical system more than any other generation. But now, they're learning wilderness first aid, taking CPR refreshers, buying home medical kits that go far beyond Band-Aids, and stocking prescription backups, because supply chain disruptions in the pharmaceutical world are becoming a monthly occurrence. The truth is, when Americans over 50 start training their bodies like their lives may depend on it, that's a cultural alarm bell. They don't waste time. They don't chase trends. They prepare when they feel something is coming, and right now, tens of millions of them are getting physically stronger, more capable, and more independent because they understand that in a destabilizing world, mobility, strength, and endurance are not luxuries, they're survival prerequisites. The communication backup movement. Older Americans. Quietly rebuilding a post-grid network. Something that almost nobody in mainstream media is acknowledging, but that emergency preparedness instructors are absolutely stunned by, is the sudden surge of Americans over 50 investing in alternative communication systems. And not because they want a new hobby. They're preparing for the possibility that traditional networks, cell towers, internet service providers, cloud-based messaging could be compromised or shut down during a major national event. And the scale of this shift is staggering. In the last year alone, ham radio licensing among adults aged 50-plus increased by 36%, the largest demographic spike ever recorded since the program began in 1912. And here's the kicker. These people aren't joining for nostalgia or tinkering. They're joining because they understand how fragile a digitally centralized society has become. They've lived long enough to remember life before instant communication, and they know exactly how paralyzed people become when their phone dies or the Wi-Fi goes out. Alongside ham radio, there's been an explosion of purchases of GMRS radios, satellite communicators, encrypted walkie-talkies, Faraday bags, and offline map systems. Quietly, deliberately, Americans over 50 are building neighborhood message relays, establishing check-in protocols, learning Morse code, and even coordinating emergency frequencies with trusted neighbors and family. And if you ask them why, the answer is nearly universal. Because the system is too fragile now. Think about it just in the last 3 years. We've had record-breaking cyber attacks on hospitals, food production plants, state governments, major transportation hubs, and power grids. A widespread communications outage is not some Hollywood fantasy, it's a documented trend. And older Americans, who tend to value self-reliance and have decades of lived experience, know that when communication goes down, chaos rises immediately. The power of this movement is in its subtlety. They're not broadcasting it online, they're not bragging, they're not fear-mongering, they're building resilience. They're making sure their kids can reach them even if cell towers fail. They're making sure their communities can coordinate safety if the internet goes dark. And this is something younger generations aren't even thinking about because they've never known anything but hyperconnectivity. This pivot to analog and decentralized communication is one of the strongest indicators that older Americans sense a major disruption ahead because they're preparing for a world where connection isn't guaranteed, and the people who prepare for that world are the ones who stay calm when everyone else panics. The explosion of practical skill building. Americans over 50, relearning what America forgot. One of the biggest and most overlooked signs that Americans over 50 believe something major is coming is the sudden revival of practical skills. Skills this country let decay for decades. And I'm not talking about cute hobby gardening or weekend woodworking. I'm talking about essential, hard, survival-centric skills that keep a household functioning when systems break. Over the last 2 years, enrollment in in-person workshops for canning, food preservation, small engine repair, home electrical troubleshooting, livestock tending, seed saving, herbal medicine making, and off-grid cooking has skyrocketed among the 50-plus demographic. Libraries across the country have quietly reported a 54% increase in checkouts of books on self-sufficiency and mechanical repair among older adults, and YouTube creators who teach things like fixing a furnace igniter or changing brake lines safely are seeing an explosion of viewers in their late 50s and 60s viewers who never cared about these topics a decade ago. What does that tell you? It tells you that Americans over 50 are reading the writing on the wall. They're watching supply chains stumble, trades labor shortages deepen, home repair services become overwhelmed, grocery shelves fluctuate unpredictably, and emergency wait times balloon. They understand the reality. If the system falters even briefly, the people with skills, not the people with opinions, will be the ones who maintain stability. And this shift is happening in silence. You don't see people posting TikToks bragging about learning how to pressure can soup or replace a water pump. You don't hear retirees boasting at dinner parties about mastering off-grid sanitation. These are humble, practical, deeply strategic decisions being made by people who have lived long enough to understand that outsourcing every survival skill to corporations, apps, and delivery services was always a mistake. And honestly, what makes this movement so impressive is how intentional it is. Older Americans are teaching their kids and grandkids how to sharpen tools, start a fire safely, store food long-term, identify edible plants, and perform basic car repairs. They're passing on knowledge that used to live in every household before everything became just call someone. And when a generation that grew up believing in stability suddenly begins preparing for instability, building skill after skill after skill, it means they feel the shift coming. And they're getting ready in the one way that history has always rewarded, by becoming capable. The strategic medical stockpiling and health autonomy shift among older Americans. What's happening right now with Americans over 50 and their approach to healthcare is something I don't think people fully grasp, and it might be one of the clearest indicators that this demographic knows something major is coming. Over the past 18 months, there has been an unprecedented surge in private medical stockpiling prescription backups. Essential over-the-counter medications, wound care supplies, vitamins, antibiotics through legal telehealth programs, and even small at-home diagnostic tools like portable EKGs and oxygen saturation monitors. And this isn't panic buying. This is strategic foresight. People over 50 have lived long enough to feel the system cracking. Doctor shortages, skyrocketing appointment wait times, record levels of nurse burnout, hospital closures in rural areas, and drug shortages hitting everything from insulin to basic antibiotics. The FDA even released reports admitting that over 130 essential medications have entered scarce supply categories in the last year alone. Americans over 50 are seeing these signals, and they're reacting in ways younger generations aren't even thinking about. They're getting medical training, actual training. Enrollment in CERT programs, first aid certifications, stop the bleed courses, wound management classes, and even entry-level EMT workshops is exploding among retirees and near retirees. Pharmacies are reporting unusual increases in requests for long shelf-life medications, and telemedicine companies are quietly noting that a significant portion of new patients aged 55 to 70 aren't seeking treatment, they're seeking preparedness. They want guidance on how to legally secure backups, how to store medications, how to rotate supplies, and how to maintain chronic conditions independently if the grid goes down or pharmacies can't restock for weeks. And you can't blame them. A majority of Americans over 50 remember a time when the healthcare system actually functioned, when a doctor could see you the same week, when emergency rooms weren't overwhelmed, and when basic medications didn't mysteriously vanish from shelves. So when they see this level of fragility, they understand what it means. In a crisis, you're on your own. And what's so telling is that this demographic used to be the one that trusted the system the most. They grew up in the era of strong institutions. But now, they're taking control of their health in a way that screams, we cannot rely on the system anymore. Quietly, without panic, they're building medical autonomy. They're preparing for disruptions that younger generations think are impossible, and they're doing it because they've seen how fast stability collapses when pressure hits a broken system. The rise of micro-communities and local alliance building among adults over 50. Perhaps the most revealing development, and one that should honestly make everyone pause, is the rapid rise of micro-communities, alliances, skill-sharing circles, and neighborhood resilience networks being formed by Americans over 50 who sense that the nation is entering a period where local cooperation may matter more than federal capability. This isn't some fringe concept. This is a documented, accelerating movement. Across the country, older Americans are organizing weekly meetups, preparedness groups, neighborhood watch expansions, shared resource networks, carpentry circles, garden co-ops, water testing groups, firearm safety communities, emergency communication clusters, and barter prep groups. Participation among people 50 to 75 has increased by over 60% in the last 2 years, according to community organization data. And what's wild is these aren't stereotypical preppers. These are suburban grandparents, retired teachers, former corporate workers, church volunteers, nurses, accountants, and people who used to believe society was stable enough that you didn't need to think about these things. But now, they're seeing the fractures, political fragmentation, rising crime, unreliable infrastructure, cyber threats, grid instability, demographic shifts, and a government that appears increasingly overwhelmed and reactive instead of strategic. Older Americans are meeting quietly and saying, if something big happens, we need each other. And this marks an enormous cultural pivot because America spent the last 2 decades growing more isolated, more individualized, more disconnected from neighbors. Yet suddenly, people over 50 are reversing that trend and rebuilding the kind of community cohesion that historically carries nations through crisis. They're mapping who has medical skills, who has tools, who has a generator, who has gardening knowledge, who owns a truck, who can do repairs, who knows land navigation, who has security training. They're conducting local drills. They're establishing emergency meetup points. They're compiling shared resource lists and rotating responsibilities. And most importantly, they're building trust. Because older Americans understand something younger generations haven't fully internalized yet. No one survives alone. When systems fail, when institutions collapse, when supply chains falter, it's the people right next to you who determine whether your community withstands the shock. And the fact that this demographic, not prone to panic, not driven by trends, is proactively building local alliances tells you everything. They feel a shift coming. They're preparing socially, structurally, and psychologically for a world where your neighbors matter more than your newsfeed. One of the loudest silent indicators that Americans over 50 know something major is approaching is the massive wave of home fortification and personal security upgrades happening behind closed doors. And it's not being reported because people aren't announcing it, they're just doing it. For the first time since post-9/11, hardware stores and specialty suppliers nationwide are reporting a triple-digit increase in purchases of things like heavy-duty deadbolts, reinforced door frames, motion sensor floodlights, window security film, backup locks, perimeter alarms, solar-powered cameras, and even old-fashioned neighborhood siren systems that haven't been popular in decades. And homeowners over 50 are leading the surge. And this isn't paranoia, it's informed caution. They're looking at rising property crime, police understaffing, delayed emergency response times, and the growing sense that urban instability isn't staying urban anymore. They're also old enough to remember how drastically life changed during the 1970s energy crisis, the Rodney King riots, the 2008 recession, and the 2020 chaos. They understand that when society gets tense, when institutions strain, when people feel cornered, crime isn't a moral issue, it's a pressure release issue. And Americans over 50 are quietly preparing to make sure their homes aren't the easiest targets. What's even more revealing is the simultaneous rise in self-defense education among this demographic. We're seeing huge attendance spikes in de-escalation workshops, home defense classes, pepper spray training, firearm safety refreshers, situational awareness courses, and even group preparedness seminars, where neighbors walk through mock emergency scenarios together. There's also been an increase in purchases of non-lethal protection tools like gel pepper sprays, stun devices, tactical flashlights, and door jammers that older adults say help them feel more secure without escalating risk. And behind all these actions is a simple truth. Older Americans understand vulnerability differently. They know their reaction time isn't what it used to be. They know a home break-in or social disruption could put them at higher risk than younger generations. So they're reinforcing the one place they can control their environment. They're transforming suburban homes into resilient hubs, upgrading smoke detectors to smart systems, adding backup heat sources, storing extra blankets and lighting, creating safe rooms, securing important documents, and coordinating with neighbors so that no one is isolated. And when an entire generation that has always valued stability begins quietly turning their homes into fortified autonomous units, that's not coincidence, that's advanced warning behavior. They're preparing for the possibility that help might not be as quick, as available, or as dependable as it once was. And they're doing it because they feel the world tightening in a way that demands readiness, not hope. Older Americans are letting go of the illusion that normal is coming back. The biggest, clearest, most powerful sign that Americans over 50 know something major is coming isn't anything you can buy, store, protect, grow, or install. It's the massive psychological shift happening across this entire age group. A shift that researchers and sociologists are calling unprecedented because it marks a fundamental break from the worldview that shaped the baby boomer and Gen X generations. For most of their lives, these groups believed in institutional stability, the resilience of the economy, the reliability of government, the safety of suburban life, and the assumption that disruptions were temporary and the country would always bounce back. But over the last 5 years, between political division, global conflict, inflation shocks, supply chain breakdowns, cyber attacks, infrastructure failures, banking instability, and a cultural fragmentation unlike anything since the late 1960s, older Americans have stopped expecting a return to normal. And that shift alone explains why they're preparing more aggressively, more intelligently, and more quietly than any other demographic. They see what younger generations don't fully grasp. They've lived through multiple eras, and they can tell when a cycle has ended. They know when a nation is transitioning from one historical phase to another, and the instinct they're experiencing right now, the sense that we are heading into turbulence that won't resolve overnight, is the same instinct previous generations felt before major national shifts. And what's so striking is that this isn't fear. This is acceptance. Older Americans are reevaluating everything: their spending, their health, their community ties, their location, their skills, their dependencies. They're simplifying their lives, eliminating unnecessary risk, getting serious about self-reliance, repairing relationships, strengthening family bonds, documenting their finances, organizing critical paperwork, and teaching their children and grandchildren the skills and values they believe the coming era will require. They're not waiting for someone to fix the country. They're preparing their households to withstand whatever comes next. And this psychological adjustment, the letting go of blind optimism, the grounding of expectations, the embracing of preparedness, is the clearest sign that they understand what many still deny. We are living through the early stages of a societal transition, and those who prepare mentally will fare better than those who cling to the past. When a generation that has lived through wars, crashes, crises, and recoveries collectively stops believing in normal, that means they recognize a historic turning point. And they're getting ready not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, intelligently, and with a seriousness that should make the rest of the country pay attention. Look, if there's one thing you should take from all of this, it's that none of these movements, none of these patterns are random. They're signals. Older Americans aren't preparing because it's trendy. They're preparing because they can feel the shift coming long before the rest of the country wakes up to it. And if you're sitting there hoping things will magically go back to normal, then you're setting yourself up to be blindsided at the exact moment when preparation matters most. The world is changing faster than our institutions can respond, and the people who understand that are quietly putting themselves in a position of strength mentally, financially, physically, and strategically. And now the question becomes, are you going to be one of them, or are you going to wait until it's too late? If this video opened your eyes even a little, then don't just close the app and move on. Think about your situation, your family, your community. Think about what you rely on and what would happen if those systems faltered for even a week. Preparation isn't panic. Preparation is responsibility. And the people who stay calm in crisis aren't the ones who hope they're the ones who prepare. So if you found this valuable, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation is only getting started. And trust me, you're going to want to be here for what comes next. Stay aware, stay ready, and take care of the people you love, because the ones who are paying attention already know something big is coming. I'll see you in the next one. Stay prepared.